let me tell you a little bit about who I am so I can establish just a little bit of credibility with you around assessment of student learning outcomes, because you may wonder why on earth would a college president talk about student learning outcomes. It's because I am absolutely passionate. And I just noticed in the chat is the article that I wrote that kind of got me connected here today. So if you have a chance to read that, or if I get too boring, read it during my presentation. But I'm going to share my screen very quickly. And we're going to make this very interactive. So bear with me for just a second. And let's start from this slideshow from the beginning. There it is. All right. So this is just a little, let me tell you what we're talking about. It's the Friday student learning outcomes talk. So I'm excited about that. So again, I've been president of Clark State here. This is my 12th year. Prior to that, I was chancellor of a campus in Arkansas, a four-year university, Arkansas Tech University. I was chancellor of the two-year campus. For many years, I was a full professor of English at Arkansas Tech University. If you must know, my background is in 18th century British literature, which I get to talk about once a year for about 30 seconds. So we won't talk about that anymore. But this is a little bit about my background. I've been involved in accreditation and student learning outcomes for 30 years. And my background, again, as an English faculty member, as well as an assessment committee co-chair, writer of accreditation comprehensive study reports, and serving on general education committees around assessment of student learning has been the most rewarding work of my career. I still write on it, I still talk about it, and it's something that is very near and dear to my heart. But that's really just to establish a little bit of my background. And I've also had a lot of national exposure with being a negotiator in the most recent round of negotiator rulemaking for program quality and accreditation. So that was exciting as well. And I'm very proud of the fact that I was on the College Health Association COVID task force. Very proud of that work. So anyway, that was a good committee. So without further hesitation, let's just dive right in. And I wanted to talk a little, whoopsies, back. Let's go back. Sorry about that. I want to ask the group before we get started, kind of talking about what is learner-centric. So I will still use the term student and learner interchangeably, but I prefer learner because it implies all of us. I feel like when we talk about students, we're talking about a specific relationship. When we talk about learners, we're talking about all of us. It's more of a 360-degree experience to talk about learners. And so I try to use that word more, but you will see me slip from time to time. But revisiting kind of learner-centric models in higher education. And I know community colleges are really proud of it, but are we really learner-centric? Are we really putting learning at the center of what we do? And how do we know that? So could we just kind of have an open discussion together about what are some of our core principles around a learner-centric model in higher education at your own institution? What's aspirational? What's actually happening at your institution that puts learners in the center of the work that you're doing? And I hope the Padlet's going crazy. But it may not be because it's Friday and it's early on the East or the West Coast. Any questions or anyone want to chime in? Alicia, are you getting anything?
So I think this is a very, very important question that I think has been keeping us going over the years, right? Because the question really is, how are we making sure that we address the needs of every single student that comes to our classroom? The idea behind student learning outcomes is that students attain certain skills and competencies as a result of instruction. It's not just that, you know, with best of intention, I'm there in the middle of the classroom lecturing at the students that I serve for a couple of hours, keeping my fingers crossed that they learn what I think they should learn. everyone is different. Everybody's approaching the classroom discussion, the instructional activity from a different perspective, from the different need. So now, again, going back to my initial comment about the dawn of artificial intelligence as we experience it, I think ChatGPT and other AI-driven tools are making it very, very transparent, very clear to us that, you know, there is something happening outside of the classroom walls, and we need to be reacting to it. So that's where we are right now. And I think that, again, if we don't take ourselves seriously enough to talk about what it is that students learn, then ChatGPT is going to take over. Because ultimately, the public, our students, are the ones who are going to be asking questions, looking for specific information, for specific contexts, for specific skills and competencies that will help them cope, be successful in their daily lives. If that's denied because of our composition of the classroom, where there is this sage on the stage and everyone, please pay attention, be quiet, and then we'll ask you questions, then that's the sort of like a dated model that's become quite dated very, 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 very quickly. And we really don't know what's going to happen in a year or two, to be honest.
Well, and on top of that, I'm going to talk about AI a little bit later. And I do want to respond to one thing that you said as well. And I know I see Leslie and Helen have their hands up. I promise I'll get to you just one second. But I want to react a little bit to something that you said. So it's not just our students, of course, as stakeholders in this. We'll talk about that a little bit later too, but our employers, and some of our employers, I'm sure in your different parts of the world, are saying, well, we've lost confidence in your ability to do this, so we're just going to bring it in-house and do it ourselves. And every time I hear that, I go crazy. But then I ask, why? Why is that? Am I not able to show or demonstrate that learning has occurred well enough to show my value add? So we'll talk a little bit about that. Leslie and then Helen. Or are they putting it in the chat? I'm sorry.
Leslie, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hi, do you want me to turn on my camera too?
Whatever works.
Yeah, I can do it. Okay. Yeah, I'd like to echo what both of you have said. I think it's incredibly important in the California community colleges. I don't know if I should introduce myself or not, but
yeah, please.
I was statewide president of the faculty in the 90s, and I then became an associate vice chancellor at City College of San Francisco for governmental relations. So I've been very, very concerned about the policies, and I am working on a project called Putting the Community Back in the Community Colleges, because they have used outcomes to actually narrow the population of who gets into the community colleges in California. It's really dramatic. The loss of students have been massive. They're really focused only on transfer students. And of course, we are vital to not only training for or access to employment, but also building basic skills. And I'm not calling it remediation for a specific reason. It can be immigrants that have never had the skills, or it can just, people just didn't get the skills. And we need to give them a chance to explore their options. And our policies now punish exploration. They call it failure. It's not failure to explore your talents and to find what they are. And we're the only, community colleges are the only one in California that nowadays pay for performance. Not at the UCs, not at the CSUs, not even at the K-12s, but they've selected the community colleges with a very, very narrow, institutionally research-driven, not student-driven, outcome-based funding formula that is just driving out the working poor. It is a very, very tragic. We really need to work, as you guys, I believe, very much are supporting, that students determine what they need, that institutions need to listen to the students, and the broader based and the more relevant we can make our education. I've been looking at quotes from 1947 by Truman about how community colleges need to be nationwide if we want our democracy to exceed. And in 1960, Clark Kerr talking about how community colleges are the opportunity engine. And these are beautiful statements, and we have just and the research they use, this is it. This is the research that's funded by Gates and other foundations. It says, believe it or not, that if you enter community colleges 1A ready and calculus ready, you get through faster than if you start at literacy. Now, that's not research.
Leslie, I'm sorry. I want to respond to a few things that you're saying,
Okay.
because
Okay.
I've got a lot of, not a lot, but I've got some experience with exactly what you're talking about.
Okay.
So this is very traditional in nursing program design, right? Lots of designs are not learner-centric. So what they are how do I keep people out? How do I get the best outcomes in order, right? And in community colleges, we swayed much too far in the early to mid 2000s around responding to some of those questionable imperatives, right? From whether it's foundations, legislators, or some researchers within our own ranks who felt like this was a way to improve these. And what also drove this, that if not that any of you watched any of the negotiated rulemaking, because if you did, you'd still be asleep. But you would have heard me arguing vehemently against the college scorecard, against the way that we do try to demonstrate outcomes when we're not capturing what is student intent. So if we don't capture what student intent is, I don't know if your colleges have experienced the same thing that mine has, but 10 years ago, I was 60% full-time students and 40% part-time. I'm 80% part-time students now.
Right.
Did the pandemic change some of that? Absolutely it did, but not all of it. It changed because our people need access to education on their own time. They need an equity mindset design so that they're not locked into, right? Like, I mean, who can take a full-time load right now if you've got all the demands on your time and unreliable transportation? I mean, this is really challenging. And so that's why I'm arguing for outcomes that are designed with, from the beginning, student intent in mind, and then to completion. My state as well, and I saw somebody from Lorain Community College on here, up in Lorain, one of our awesome community colleges in Ohio, and we are totally outcomes funded. However, we found a way to bake into it equity. We found a way to bake into it. We're not in the one size fits all that the universities are. So Ohio State doesn't have the same funding formula that Clark or Lorain does. And we designed it. And I think I don't mind getting funded based on outcomes that are designed with that student intent in mind. But if they're designed based on what somebody says, of course, if you have a person, and then the last thing I'll say, of course, if you have a person who takes calculus and that's your math completer or whatever, but this is my equity statement for the day as well around dual enrollment or concurrent enrollment. We have not as a college prioritized, the college level for our wealthy school districts, for example, where students could take calculus. They're just basically taking it on our dime, and we're chasing completers, versus the student who really needs to see the gain or develop the skill and wouldn't have access to higher education otherwise. That's where we put our resources in terms of dual enrollment as well, in that kind of, and we want to bring everyone up, but our priority is definitely those students. I'm sorry, but I think that Helen was it Helen? She may have taken her hand down because I talked too much. I'm sorry.
No, I took my hand down because I'm mindful of the time and monitoring my own need to say something versus letting you finish your presentation. So I took my hand down.
Well, I think we're having a great conversation around what these outcomes are. And I'm trying to look at the chat too, but I'll move on to the next topic so we can have even more conversation. Let's see here. Okay. There. So just very quickly to frame all of this too, we've got some challenges in higher education, and I'm sure you've noticed. Certainly, I mentioned earlier, competition from alternative credential providers who are outside of academia. I'm sure you've heard this. Everybody has heard, well, I don't even need what Clark State is providing in order to get a job. Well, that's taking the learner out of what I'm doing. I mean, that really is a challenge. If I'm not adding any value, how can I do that for the student and consult the student as well? Misalignment of credentials, right? Degrees that don't match workforce needs. And I'm not talking about sunsetting programs and getting rid of programs or electives. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about if you're I'm talking about equity in programs too. Are students leaving those programs with gains financially, gains academically that they can take for transfer, et cetera? Misunderstanding and certainly the fear of artificial intelligence. Right now, my faculty have been working the past 2 years on incorporating AI into the various classes, whether it's nursing, diagnostic medical sonography, modeling and simulation, cybersecurity, or transfer in sociology. So they're looking at how to incorporate AI. And I was really struck by what many of you are probably familiar with Paul LeBlanc, who was the president at Southern New Hampshire University, and he's now kind of he's emeritus, but he's public intellectual, right? But he talked a lot about this recently about instead of pushing back on AI, right? How can we incorporate it into our classes and make the learner at the center of it by asking the learner to share the prompts that you use to generate your AI work? What additional prompts came about because you were incorporating AI? How did you determine the veracity of the statements and the facts that you received? And are you learning critical thinking? In other words, AI is not about discovery of knowledge. AI is about confirmation and critical thinking skills, right? So how do we turn that into a learner-centric model rather than they're all cheating, they're all using ChatGPT? And then devaluing documentation of artifacts of learning that are, for example, I feel like our students have learned a lot before they've even come to us. But we say, no, the clock starts today. So how do we really incorporate, and moving forward, this will be the model for higher education. I'm not a prognosticator, but what I will say is that the future is what happened before they came, while they're here, and after. That's going to be our whole purview versus their time here, right? So think about the temporality of the work that we're doing too. And then finally, I'm on my lifelong battle with the credit hour, the Carnegie unit. And for anyone who's ever heard me talk or heard of me, I am definitely associated with that battle that I've lost the past 30 some years. I retire in a year and a half, and I will say this, it's on. With a credit hour. But it really does, it drives financial aid, it drives transfer, but it is not a measure of learning. And we all know that. We all know that learning occurs in so many different places, wherever and whenever students can apply their learning as well. So I also want to talk about this concept with everybody. How does our reliance on seat time, how does that undermine student learning outcomes, the learner, what's happening? What are better ways to rethink this whole model? We've tried, how about 8-week terms instead of 16 weeks? How about quarters instead of semesters instead of quarters? Online learning. Does any of it, are we bearing fruit? What is a way that we can kind of think about measuring learning that's not dependent on kind of our traditional models? Anyone? That's a deep, deep question. Anyone want to respond or?
Somebody did mention in the chat that just the expectation of seat time as a measure of learning can, damage online programs because it's really kind of hard if you're not having that face-to-face seat time. It's really hard to measure how much time somebody's actually spending doing the work and actual learning and meeting their outcomes. So
Right, and making sure that they're achieving what is set out in the program or course to do. Exactly. And that's a really good point. And of course, that's something that this Department of Education is very concerned about as well. In the current administration, I would also add too, though, what about, I'm sure many of your colleges have a prior learning assessment. I'm sure you have a prior learning assessment policy. I urge you to take a look at that. And then this is where everybody hangs up, but I urge you to see how you can help develop that policy, how you can help expand that policy, because I don't know about you, but I'm always surprised and impressed and just bowled over by what our students bring to us that they already know. How do we identify that? How do we get to that? And that wasn't about a credit hour, right? That was about prior learning, whether it was in high school, another college, or on the job. And so I think we really need to challenge our mindset about these things. And again, I think this is a really good question that kind of follows along with that. What are some of the potential risks of continuing to use that kind of measurement, to use seat time? And your 16-week blocks, or look at me, how creative I am. I went to 8 weeks. I mean, or, how do we try to rethink this whole idea of the credit hour as a primary measure of learning? How can you kind of take a look at accurately reflecting student competencies in other ways beyond time? Any ideas or suggestions?
Dr. Blondin, if I may add to this discussion, what I see, what I hear from faculty and counselors is that we are still in this mode of evaluation of student record, of what it is that students bring to the counselor's office, rather than having, I don't know, let's say a panel, or I don't know, a faculty member in the room, so that students can actually demonstrate what the skills and competencies that they bring with them. And I think that's the rub here, that
Yes.
the outcome is, again, successful evaluation of paperwork. Okay, really, we are not even looking at the student, right? We are just looking at the paperwork that they bring to the office. And I think that's the contention, because again, AI is going to do it for us. Students will take advantage of it because those tools are widely available. Why would they need to be seeking anybody's approval to do anything any longer, right? It's more about what I think and what I'm trying to accomplish in life, not necessarily what someone thinks about the paperwork that I bring to the office.
So, Yarek, I want to say this too. Think about as an admissions. Let's pretend for a minute like we're in the admissions office, which at community colleges is actually the financial aid office. So let's pretend like we're in the financial aid office. All right. And a student has been admitted, and what do they write or type into their applications, right? They have to come up with some type of degree path, right? And they're pushed to do it. So they're pushed, first of all, we push students into credit programs because that's where financial aid is. And how do they get financial aid? Based on the number of credit hours they take, right? But what if we had a model where a student came and said, you know what I want? I want to learn X so I can do Y. And this is what that looks like. And maybe it's even, think about this crazy thing. Maybe it's even a subscription model in higher education where, I don't know about any of you, but I go to Amazon to get, let's say, vitamins, and it'll say, do you want to subscribe, or is this a one-time purchase? And I always write one-time purchase because I'm lazy and I'm afraid I won't use all the vitamins. But I need all the vitamins. I need 30 vitamins every month to keep myself healthy, right? What if that were our model? What if our model were to keep students engaged in a longer, more attenuated way, that they're lifelong learners? There are just so many different models we can think of that could add value to students. And it would definitely change the work that we do and the work that our faculty and staff do. But I think there are a lot of different models we can think of as we talk about how do we capture student intent? Because a lot of times we're shoehorning student intent. A student comes to us and says, you know, all I need is this one welding class. I just need one welding class because my boss thinks he thinks I need more TIG welding instruction. So I go and I get TIG welding, but you know what on the application it says? It says I'm an associate degree seeking student so that I can get financial aid. All I need to do is learn X. I don't need to, but now I'm a non-completer. Back to Leslie's comment earlier, you know, I'm considered a non-completer. I'm a failure, but I'm not a failure because I just made $5 more an hour on my job site. So those are very philosophical topics, and I will move on, but just food for thought for everybody.
So again, you know, this is exactly what we need to hear, because again, philosophy is really what's underlining on all our interactions. This is what we think. We may not realize it when as we are, you know, having these discussions, but there is certain assumptions that we operate under. And again, when you look at what's happening in community colleges, you know, a student comes in, they lost a job 2 days ago, now they need a new one. Well, yeah, there is the counselor's office. 2 weeks from now, you have an appointment. Then the semester starts in January. You need to take geography, political science, and then Spanish.
Right.
And after a year and a half, we are going to put you on the waiting list to our nursing program.
And you're going to burn financial aid, and then your eligibility will be lost because and then you're going to have all this credit accumulation. So this is what I always say when I'm speaking externally to non-higher ed audiences. I always start with this. Let's pretend like you want to buy drive a Toyota. Okay. You want to go buy a Toyota, and I go to the dealership in Springfield, Ohio, and I say, hey, I'm ready. And they say, you know what? Come back on January 15th. Or June 1st, or August 15th, and I'll buy you a car. I mean, you could buy a car one of those 3 days. Otherwise, you're not in. And that's kind of how we do it a little bit. And part of it is this kind of concept around how we're designed versus without intentionality versus being designed with intentionality with the student learning outcome that you want first, right? I mean, we shouldn't say, you know, we need a sociology class. No, what do we want students to learn in this class? Let's design it around that. So that's a very rich conversation to have. And I've got some other ideas about additional subscription model I can talk about offline later. That's very interesting. So there's a lot of resistance, as you can only imagine. I'm sure many of you are thinking that I'm full of beans, that I'm not making a lot of sense around student learning outcomes, and that they're just a fad. They're going to go away. No one cares about this, but we do, especially if they matter, especially if they're super learner-centric and can demonstrate, they can improve the institution. That's what we do with our student learning outcomes, aggregate them, and then we use them to budget. I mean, we use them to create, how students did. If students didn't do well right now, we're having some challenges, for example, in pharmacology, in our nursing and health career programs, just for whatever reason, students, and faculty are doing their very best, but we took a lot of resources, this past year to do some intentional program design and get some technology and sorry to use a word, Leslie, remediation kind of software, developmental software to help out the students in pharmacology. And so I think that's a good example too of why we start with, what aren't they learning? And we know that because we're measuring these outcomes. So why have institutions been slow to adopt kind of a comprehensive approach to student learning outcomes? And what could we do to help overcome the resistance with faculty? Because a lot of faculty members, myself included when I was in English, well, I know what to teach. I know what they need. But how do we really, really fully understand what a student needs in order to move to the next level? What is the next level? How do we define that? So another example, and this is a 90s example from back when I first started teaching in the early 90s. I'll never forget, a student came to me and she was very upset. She had a history paper due her first semester. She was in a history class, and my class was expository writing. So we're talking about the modes of composition, compare, contrast, classification. So she's writing 3 to 5 page papers in my class to demonstrate these modes, right? And she comes to me and she says, Ms. Blondin, I can't believe this. I've got this research paper that's due. It's due in history, and I don't know how to write this research paper, but I'm in your class and I know how to write this. I said, first of all, let's start here. You know how to write. That's good. You know how to invent. You know how to develop. I said, but what I did do, because I was at a small enough place where I said, hey, let's talk to the history professor. And that became a conversation with the whole department. And they said, you know what? We should put this paper in the next semester. Why are we doing this now when we're not building, like, the curriculum's not making sense? If our students are failing in history, but they're doing well in English, that makes no sense, right? If they're trying to apply those skills. So I think that there's a lot of intentional program design with faculty conversations around what really needs to hang together, what will complement, what will reinforce here within programs. So that's just food for thought. But I'd like to get other people's opinions about some of these questions here.
Dr. Blondin,
Yes.
it's just, I see your first questions, why have many institutions have not been slow to fully embrace, the assessments? And is it because we don't fund student learning? The institutions are focused on resources as far as, you know, we're talking about guided pathways, other initiatives. The money's not focused on student learning. The funding, it comes from other initiatives. The minute we start funding student learning, that's why I think you're going to flip these institutions upside down and make that 360 connection.
Enrique, I agree. I agree with you. And I think that what we're funding right now, like back again, and there are a lot of perverse incentives in higher education that we don't even, I mean, that if you just sat and thought a little bit about various how we are funded, or for that matter, internally as colleges, how we budget and how we do conduct our various business. That's absolutely true. And I don't think, but I think that outcomes assessment needs to come from faculty, and then of course on the student affairs or business affairs side for how they're going to assess their success of their areas as well. But I'm talking really about faculty and student learning, direct student learning right now. But how do we communicate and collaborate around what matters most versus, just all the different expectations that students have to juggle across the curriculum? Because I do think too, there's a consistency, and I'm not trying to take away from academic freedom, but a consistency that can be had with student learning outcomes being very clear to learners as well. Somebody's also, okay, SLOs can be an integrity issue. The institution says you will learn this. Assessment allows to see if students are achieving that learning, right? Versus grades, that old argument. Helen.
Okay, I may be out of order here. I come from a K-12 background, and I'm also currently an instructional designer, no longer teaching actively. I was shocked when I came into the higher ed institutions to realize that faculty are hired based on subject matter expertise, and there is no requirement that they have any pedagogical or skill or training in how to teach. And to me, that spills over in so many areas, but it spills over into the development of SLOs, because I look at my college SLOs, some of them are egregiously bad. And so how can we be measuring anything when the quantifier, if you will, is nonsensical almost? And I don't have, well, one answer I have is that higher ed faculty need to have the expectation that they have learned how to teach, but I don't have the global answer. And I may be a voice in the wind since I'm coming from what could be considered a non-faculty perspective, but it just seems, as an outsider, it seems to me such a glaring deficit in what we're trying to do in our institutions. I'll stop.
So no, I couldn't agree with you more. And I always tell people, I mean, I may have a PhD in 18th century British literature, but I can't teach at Springfield High School. I mean, in the K-12 system, I can teach at the college level. I do think that learning or teaching techniques, teaching should be valued and assessed as well, particularly at community colleges, where that is the, number one relationship that our students have is with the instructor, with the professor. I do agree. And I think that I'm also reading here that there is, and that also that lack of some of the fundamentals that rather than just subject matter expertise, which is very important, but the lack of fundamentals can also create what Alicia wrote here, a buy-in to SLOs and assessing them in general, leading to some inconsistency. There was also, yes, HLC's criteria 3 focuses on quality and are interested in the institution having quality. So I should have said that I just finished my tour of duty as the chair of the Higher Learning Commission Board. And we just actually addressed this, Nick. We just collapsed our criteria 3 and 4, which were different parts of teaching. One was teaching and learning resources. One was assessment. We put them together and said, they're the same thing. Let's streamline this. SACs, I saw somebody refer to SACs and accreditation forces the issue, but I have no idea if our students could communicate the fact that they have theoretically completed these. SACs is rather prescriptive in its approach, not as institutionally flexible as some of the others, but I think that it's really important too that any student learning outcomes, not to drill down and myself be too prescriptive, but are listed, that are discussed and gone over and transparent for students. Because I think students deserve to know what we're measuring and what they're being measured on, even if it's not related to grades. They deserve to know. But that's a very good point, Nicole. And then Enrique said earlier, yeah, funding absolutely drives some of these issues and the way that we were focused to. Somebody put another comment in there. Yeah, sometimes they're poorly written, as in the student will pass the course. Oh yeah, that's not appropriate. We need a much bigger conversation to write solid SLOs, how to measure them and how to assess them. And that includes all faculty. And one of the reasons I got into assessment way back in the 90s is because I realized that it added a lot of value to my teaching. And it gave me a lot of feedback, back to Helen's point, that we didn't have the training. Like I had one class, which was like, you're an English teacher now. You teach undergraduates at Arizona State University. And so I think that having student learning outcomes really gave me a lot of feedback about what my students, and some people don't take it seriously, which is unfortunate because that is where we improve our courses and make adjustments. I mean, I use those same practices as president of the college. And, having been demoted to president, I feel like I can still use some of those principles to move forward. So some stakeholders, let's talk about that, because I want to be mindful of everyone's time. What role should various stakeholders, faculty, students, and employers play in defining and assessing student learning outcomes to ensure they're meaningful? So in other words, what are the roles of these various groups? Because a lot of faculty would say, I do that. And then we're like, well, don't you want buy-in from the various stakeholders? What if this advisory group helped you develop those? Or what if, dare I say, students helped you develop the outcomes in a program or a course? Now, some are defined obviously by accrediting bodies in disciplines like nursing, cosmetology, welding, manufacturing, but at the same time, they're programs that you need to, you know, assess that you could get buy-in from these other stakeholders. So can we talk a little bit about that? How might you go about that at your own college, involving different groups, and how meaningful that could be? And it could also increase, to Alicia's earlier question, some faculty buy-in around what outcomes are needed. Any comments or discussion around that? Because I know we involve our employers. I mean, we ask them, how do you, I mean, what do you want in your, in this automotive technician, let's say, or diesel mechanic? What are some of the qualities that you're looking for? Then, and the businesses agree that these are the qualities. We go back, the faculty members go back and say, well, how can we develop these? Where does that learning occur within the program? And this is what I always think about too, and I want everyone to think about this when you're designing SLOs. Where does the initial learning occur? And then where does the reinforcement of that learning occur within the class or program? So there's initial learning. I first learn about how to write, what the rhetorical situation of my paper is in English. Where is the rhetorical situation in the learning that's needed for that continually reinforced in my class? It's actually reinforced in my English 1 class, in English 2, in English 1 5 times, in English 2 4 times, right? So where does the initial instruction happen? And then how do I continue to reinforce? Because you can't put a student learning outcome out there and then say, oh, they learned that once. It has to constantly be reinforced. Somebody has a comment. We had a core group start, develop a draft, and then took it out to faculty key groups. Okay, that's great. That's really good. It is my understanding that several of the SLOs we use are defined by the Texas Higher Ed Coordinating Board, especially for courses designed for academic transfer. There is more flexibility for writing them in workforce education. I do agree with that. And again, I know that we're a very, very decentralized system. We're not a system. I take that word back. We are a very decentralized operation here in Ohio. So unlike some states, we don't have we have a lot of duplication because we don't have coordination. That's the bad part. But the good part is that there's a lot of faculty ownership of the work. It's not kind of come down from the Department of Higher Education. So that is, while I think that is a challenge, I think institutionally, the faculty should be, the provost or VPAA should be leading the faculty in defining those two for themselves. Any other comments on this? So I want to talk a little bit next then about some assumptions in designing learner-centric assessment models. That these are my assumptions that we should follow as we try to focus on learner-centric assessment models. And I detail these in that article. But there should be a seamless movement between credit and non-credit. If I can figure out with my vast vocabulary a different word for credit or non-credit, I would love to, or if anyone has an idea, please send it to me, because the word non-credit is so deficit framing. And they're students at Clark State. They sit in the same chairs. They come to the same college. They use the same equipment. That non-credit, I just cannot stand that word. So I like to think of what we call at Clark State a permeable membrane between credit and non-credit. I kind of want nothing at all. I want it to all kind of flow together. That's my dream. And I've got 1.5 years left to execute it. Flex with the faculty, of course. I would not do it by myself. Flexibility in where and when and how learning has occurred. And that's a real mindset change for a lot of people, administrators, faculty, or staff. Flexibility in where and when and how learning occurs. So just kind of let that sink in for a minute. And these are, of course, my aspirational dream assumptions about how we design student learning outcomes and assessment models. Multiple stakeholders are involved in the development of outcome assessments and measurements. So learners, alumni, graduates, business, community, faculty, and staff, everybody is involved. Of course, back to Enrique's question about, or issue about funding and him bringing that up. This is very different than the way that we do things now, where faculty members in their office working on or working in a committee with other faculty members, but rarely is there kind of this level of interaction that I would require. And that would mean different coordinator duties, different union contracts, different pay structure. I mean, this would really kind of change things significantly. But I think that faculty should be the leaders in these communities getting this information. So we need to pay them for that, right? Stacking and laddering credentials to ensure various on and off ramps. I'm sure many of you do this at your institutions, but we really try to build in and bake in off ramps because our students have to take them sometimes. And I don't want them to leave here with a collection of credit hours. I want them to leave here with a certification or some type of credential so that they can come back in and come and leave when they need to, but that they have something that's of value out in the world. Hands-on learning is baked into an assessment design, like internships, on-the-job experiences, and co-ops. 85% of our students stay within our 4-county service area when they graduate. And so we want to make sure that if that's the case, why don't we assess their learning on the job more than just like the traditional internship and the last thing, that's the other thing at Clark State, when I came here, all internships were unpaid. And I said, no, that's not the way that the world works. Nobody gets, labor for free. Our students are worthwhile and they get paid just like everybody else. And then finally, policies, practices, and operations regarding learning, like prior learning assessment. It has to be transparent, usable, and fair, because a lot of PLA policies that I see, particularly that I saw when I was a peer reviewer for HLC, they're designed to create a barrier for students because we don't believe that you really learned that. We don't believe you could demonstrate that. Let's make it as hard as possible for you. And I don't think that that's right. Stacking credentials are so much easier in workforce education. We build an off-ramp at almost every semester of study for most of our workforce programs. Yes, and the big challenge is in general education and transfer, but it can be done. And it can also be done in cooperation with four-year institutions if they have a transfer pathway. And I can talk about that offline. Our number one transfer institution is Wright State University, followed by the Ohio State University. So adapting SLOs for different learning modalities, how can we try to be more adaptive in assessing what students learn across various modalities? Of course, many of you have grown your online programs post-COVID, or maybe you're dialing them back because your data shows that students aren't performing or they don't want those courses, et cetera. But what are some of the challenges in adapting SSLOs to effectively assess student learning across different modalities? I'm sorry. I'm not very good at driving this PowerPoint. Badging, adapting learning outcomes to the current workforce. Yes. Any other thoughts on how we can adapt to effectively assess student learning across different modalities? Are there built-ins, and do you use Blackboard or Canvas? Are there ways that the faculty can input into those? Oh, someone else. We have to get creative in some cases, understand that there are multiple ways, right, to assess outcomes. Yeah, definitely. Multiple measures, you have to have different, definitely for the different, but also that you also want to ensure that the online and hybrid and in-person environments are all achieving what students need in those environments. Otherwise, that's an equity problem, right? Oh, So also there's the issue with data, right? What steps can institutions take to institutionalize and operationalize analysis of data to ensure continuous improvement? So I bet a lot of you, how many of you are achieving the dream schools? You participate in the ATD network a lot, I hope. It's been very valuable for us. We joined in 2020, and our institution went on what we called a data diet, because we were so data heavy and looking at it all the time that it kind of became meaningless, because it was also very balkanized. People were here and there looking at their different data and not communicating. So we kind of went on a streamlining data diet. And what we noticed when we did that is that we were able to share data across the campus, and we had data summits, a data summit where our faculty were charged with sharing, their data in a really welcoming environment. I mean, and obviously non-punitive, because that's what people worry about, right? When you talk about student learning outcomes, if students aren't meeting it, what's going to happen to me, right? What did I do wrong? And that's not the focus at all institutionally, or should not be. But we had a number of data summits where we could share and learn. And then we also use that data, like I said earlier, to feed our budget. So if students aren't achieving, for example, the outcomes that they need in let's say our developmental math courses, right? If they're not achieving their outcomes there, what can we do to help? Are there additional resources? Do we need lab assistants? Do we need faculty? Do we need peer tutors within the classroom? Do we need supplemental instruction? Where do we move our resources, and where do we move our budget to get there? Because that's really what this is also about, is making sure our faculty have the resources that they need. Okay. And then we talked, a lot of people have already put in the chat comments about assessing workforce alignment and readiness. How can assessment of student learning outcomes bridge a gap between academic credentials and workforce needs, particularly in our environment? Would anyone like to share? Do you have an example of how the student learning outcomes have bridged a gap in academic credentials and workforce needs?
So very often when we have these discussions, it's the context of instruction, right? So in other words, you can teach chemistry sort of like in, let's just say, isolation, for lack of a better expression, right? From this purist perspective, right? That you need to know how atoms behave. But once you go into a specific skill or competency that can be applied in the workforce, that's when it becomes much, much, much more meaningful. And I think we just simply don't pay much attention to it, right? In a sense that I think, as someone mentioned already, faculty with best of intentions do not always are subject matter experts, but they are not necessarily, I don't want to say concerned, because they are. They do want to make sure that students learn things that matter. It's just that this context is from the very often scientifically understood perspective is not relevant, and that's I think what we need to be paying more attention to.
And I know too, I teach in a graduate program for Ferris State University in community college leadership. I teach the strategic planning class, and but this is relevant. I mean, graduate education and undergraduate education and they're all learning, right? So one of the ways I know that I assess within both the whole doctoral program, it's an EDD program, as well as my own course level assessment in that class, is through the bridge between academic credentials and workforce needs, right? So we make sure that we have a team of administrators review plans who aren't related to the student. So if the student is, we have groups of students develop strategic plans, and then we have outside reviewers reviewing them and providing input. They're not grading them, they're providing input to them so that the student can then improve the work that they're doing. I think that's extremely valuable to have real world, provost or a dean sharing this information with these individuals to give them feedback. And I know I always taught business writing or technical writing. I always taught those courses, and I would enlist folks in industry, in business and industry, to help review and meet with the students to set expectations about the writing that they were doing, because they would have to write, like a description, a manual for how this machine operates, etc. And instead of me reviewing it, who's never run a PLC or a programmable logic controller machine, why not have this person who works at Train, the company, that have them review it? So I think, and that takes resources, back to resources, because some people are going to do it out of the goodness of their hearts, and some people you may need to pay. I mean, and we pay our nurses preceptors. Why don't our nursing preceptors in the hospital? We pay our clinical instructors. Why don't we have that same model for arts and sciences or for business and industry? Why don't we pay have those kinds of models? And I think that's kind of a little bit of food for thought today too, how we structure those things. Advisory committees are helpful, especially when they're really used, they're really utilized for the feedback. Advisory committees can be helpful. I also think advisory committees need to be engaged often for these types of activities, rather than the once every semester meeting with dinner. They need to be really engaged, and students need to be in the advisory committee meetings as well. Applying SLOs to the workforce can be so hard because, because we graduate students who have degrees labeled in one specific way, but their skills are applicable to so many fields. Our friend recently graduated with a geology degree, is working in a lab assessing pesticide exposure. He had to think very broadly about how he could apply those skills. That's it, Nicole. That's where individualized or personalized learning comes in handy. Absolutely. Assessment of chemistry can be done in an unlimited number of ways. That's a really good response. And how can institutions ensure that the assessments remain relevant? And I think with these advisory committees, that's a great way to do that in evolving industry needs. If we think for a second that our jobs start and end when we walk through the door of our building, and that's where all of our work is conducted, then this question is a lot harder to answer. Enrique.
Yes. Also, I think the programs need to align or map their SLOs to the advisory committees, to the workforce, right? And then you will have the courses also have some sort of mapping, or you want to call it alignment. Make sure that those SLOs are current. Just take automotive for example. Are those SLOs current to the workforce? And if not, then those competencies and SLOs can change by the year. They're no longer relevant. And so I think, that those programs really need to talk to the workforce, to their, accreditation bodies. So, yeah.
You're right. And the other is that, there needs to be a lot of leadership support. This isn't just a box to check for accreditation purposes or for your state higher education authority. This is absolutely relevant to the work that we do every day. And I think that, these assessment outcomes they need to be valued. If the president or the dean or the different roles on campus don't value this information, this learner information, and I'm not saying judge the information, I'm saying they value the information, that nothing on the campus will hang together the way that it's supposed to. Other thing I'll say very quickly is, as somebody who's a big champion of accreditation and can see it as an innovator, I've never thought of it as a rote exercise to be done every 10 years. we live accreditation every day at Clark State because we value the feedback that we get, and we I mean, if it's about continuous improvement, then that needs to be held as well. Advisory committee, okay, yeah, okay, very good. Next slide here. And then beyond the classroom, how can institutions better document and validate what learning occurs outside of traditional settings? And I would love to hear from everybody about that. And please unmute and talk. So I've been doing a lot of talking, which I enjoy, as you can tell. But I would rather hear from you and your voices.
Could you please articulate the question again for us?
Yeah, how can you as an instructor or in your institution validate learning that occurs outside of the classroom? What are some ways you already do, maybe, or what are some ways that you've already thought about during this presentation that you could, internships or prior learning assessments or alternative credentialing? Are there things happening at your college or in your department that you want to share that you're doing in any of those areas that shows that a student has learned, or what level of mastery a student has gained as a result of doing some work outside the classroom that's related?
Yep, I think that's the crux of the SLO discussion. Faculty do it whether they realize it or not, but when students land in their classrooms, first thing that the students are being asked, can you do this? Go to the board and show me. Nobody's asking did you get a B+ in geography, or what was your GPA, and did you turn in all your assignments on time last time around? We don't have these conversations, right?
Yarick, I always say this: no one ever in any of the many jobs I've held ever the first day at work handed me a blue book.
There we go.
No one ever gave me a blue book and said, I need you to answer this question right now.
So here's the gap, and that's the part that again, that's what keeps us going in these discussions here. Absolutely.
I think in at San Diego City College, we have our internships or apprenticeships program. We have spaces for them to document when students complete those programs. They have program learning outcomes and the course learning outcomes. So those are built in. But we've also implemented our college assessing institutional student learning outcomes, and that goes to what Nicole just mentioned, that the co-curricular and extracurricular involvement, since we're assessing those institutional student learning outcomes, it comes from everywhere, not just in the classroom, it comes from our student services. So that helps us to better document learning that's not just happening in our classrooms, but outside the classrooms.
At Clark State, we have probably 50 to 100 work study students at any given time. And they're always learning. I mean, they're using their communication skills, they're using their writing skills, they're using their problem solving and critical thinking skills, but they're doing it on the job, right? And so how do we capture that, and what makes sense, what co-curricular? Because one of the things that does drive me crazy as a community college president, with an open access and of course a success mission, is that and learning can certainly be assessed in athletics and in all kinds of co-curricular activities, right? But what matters most to students, and I think we go back to that too, depending on your institutional type, if a student has residential life, they're living on campus, how is the co-curricular assessment? I mean, what is assessed there versus what matters most to the community college student or the 4-year residential student? That's a really good point, because they are different experiences sometimes, not always, but at work, etc. Any other comments about this? This is a really good conversation about different where learning can occur and how we assess it outside the classroom.
I think it can occur just about anywhere.
Okay.
And I think for me, it all comes back to the SLOs, which a well-written SLO can identify what some of the expectations are and maybe what direction that learning goes. And then it also, if it's well written, can lead to that assessment of learning for students and for those who are doing the assessing. But if you're just doing things that, it's the Lewis Carroll quote all over again. Well, if you don't know where you're going, you probably won't get there. But if you know where you're headed, then you can be intentional about that entire learning experience, whether it's in or outside the classroom.
That's a really good way of putting that, and appreciate the Lewis Carroll reference for sure. But I do think that learning can, I mean, obviously learning can occur anywhere, but I think how we capture that and how we as faculty all continue to lift that up is something that's really important. And then I also liked what you said, Nick, because you said, you basically echoed the I'm a learner too, because that's what I think that. So the theme this year at my college, our convocation theme and our all year theme is called leading learners. And we're leading learners, but we're also the leading learner in the classroom, right? And so we want to learn as much as we can too about what our students know, think, do, or say. So I really like that. But how can student learning outcomes assessment practices be designed to support equity for our students? Is there a way not to do a one size fits all? Is there? I mean, so many people come to us with different experiences at different levels. We have many different levels within our classroom, and how do we manage that with our assessment? Are there, are there ways that we can build a more equitable framework around how we assess student learning in our classroom and in our programs? Oh, there's a local, okay. Local companies can come and share expectations, learning competencies to our, yes, absolutely. What the expectations are. Because you can't open up the Chronicle of Higher Education right now without seeing we're questioning the value. There was one yesterday, there was an article yesterday in Inside Higher Ed, and it may have also been in the Chronicle about both parties right now, for different reasons, are kind of bearish on higher education, and that's not what we want. We've always been a bipartisan issue. We've always had bipartisan support. Why are they abandoning us? Is it real or imagined problems that we have? I don't know, but some of it I think is around how we demonstrate these outcomes as well as the value that we provide, and of course our cost. Any thoughts to equitable design for student learning outcomes? I'm sure California has this front and center for students as SLOs are designed. Alicia?
Well, I'm actually in a professional development course right now that's all about equitable grading. And this is one of the things that we're talking about is how to make them more equitable for everyone, being able to look at the data, see where the gaps are, but also how can we make sure that we are sticking to what students are learning and not just kind of holding this grade over them, because it loses a lot of value when it's, what do I need to do to get an A, instead of what should I be taking from this class? So that's something I'm actually going through right now so that I can learn better how to do this, and then hopefully hold some trainings of my own to be able to do that and expand upon that.
That's right, Alicia. I think that's important, and it does add to the discussion of this value and the cost. There are studies out there. Every so often you see those things. What is the impact of a given higher education institution on the local economy? Right? We do see those studies every so often. So this information is out there. It's just that, again, we don't really link those to skills and competencies that students acquire. It's more like, whatever happens in this pot that we stare, that we call higher education institution, well, that's their impact. But what happens in the classrooms, what is it that students learn? That's still not part of the discussion. So I think that Equity here has a huge, absolute huge potential, because it's all about student empowerment. It's all about making sure that our students know who they are once they leave our classroom walls.
But
Henry,
Jericho, yeah, I think Jerry and I have these conversations every week. Him, him and I by themselves. But how do you carry the skills and competencies from the faculty to the programs, to the college, to the community? And when I say community, you can just community overall, or the workforce, whatever it is. How do you and how do you assign the tracking mechanism? How do you know that 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 batching, or what prior learning? How do you carry that, and how do you measure it? Because we just do it. This Carnegie education system that we live in. It's how do we track that? And it's there. It stays within the instructor. It's a grade is given. And so what? Yeah.
So that's a really good question. And I know that I'm sure a lot of you use various software to track your student learning outcomes assessment. We use Watermark. But a lot of, and so there are ways to, of course, track, aggregate, and get that information. I want to go back to something that you said earlier as well, and kind of tag it on here too. Back to the cost and value to the community. We think we have a choice in sharing this information. We don't, because for most of us, we're taxpayer funded institutions, and it's our obligation to be transparent about how our students are doing and what taxpayer resources are being used for at our institutions. So I think that, and of course, that doesn't mean that we still don't need more funding. That's not what I'm saying. I'm simply saying that we need to be transparent internally first, and then externally about the work that we're doing, and be really honest about how our students are really performing. Let me give you an example. So a bunch of years ago at Clark State, when I first got here, we had we have a wonderful medical laboratory technology program that was revitalized mercifully right before the pandemic. We got new equipment and all this stuff. But prior to that, this program struggled. No one was hiring our graduates. Nobody, I mean, we at one time, the program had 25 students. It dwindled to, there were maybe 2 or 3 graduates a year. They weren't getting hired. They were doing something else that was not related. And we had to take a deep dive into what was going on. Well, first of all, the equipment they were being trained on wasn't standard laboratory equipment that was now used out in the field, right? So that was a problem. So we made a massive, like $250,000 investment in getting new equipment. We also reorganized the program around the program director and the faculty models. We tried to rethink that, get more adjunct faculty who were industry experts to help develop the curriculum, and then get that rubber stamped essentially by the people who were hiring the students. We now have one of the best medical laboratory technology programs in the state. But it was it was challenging. And it was also, and I mean this in the nicest way, because as a college president, all I want to do is tell the good news. I mean, of course I do. And so it was really hard to say, we need this program. Something's not working. It's not working for our students. Our enrollment now is around 50 students in this program. And I think by making investments, but we started with the student learning outcomes. What are they expected to know, think, do, or say? And as we looked at those, even in light of the accreditation, they weren't matching. We weren't matching what the industry wanted. We weren't even matching what the accrediting body was asking of us, and our data really pointed us in that direction. And I think that was kind of a through line. And also the other thing that we were doing was They were taking classes that they didn't need for this program, like A and P. They did not need A and P, but they were all failing kind of at that level, which was the bottleneck that kept the students from going on. So we thought, what other science class could they take that will help them there? But do they really need anatomy and physiology for a medical laboratory technology program? No, they need biology, but do they need, so they need chemistry, but they don't need this A and P class. And then we also reflected back on our A and P class to see why it's still a bit of a bottleneck, but we've improved that course too to be more learner-centric and focused on what the different programs need rather than what we think they need. So very interesting.
But Dr. Brandon, the reality is that, we're talking about, you have your slide here, equity and access. They're focused not on outcomes, more on the student achievement data. Like for example, California, we have the Vision for Success, right? That's all in percentages, grade, retention, completion rates, and we don't focus on the competencies and skills attainment. It's because that's what the funding's at. And we are more focused on equitable access outcomes instead of focusing on the student learning outcome, or you say as the learner.
Right.
And that, yeah.
And that kind of what you're describing is actually not equity. I mean, I'm not saying I'm not trying to say that you're not equitable. I was saying the model that you're describing is kind of not an equitable model, if those are the sole measurements.
But that's what's happening. That's the reality, that institutions are focused on student achievement data, and they think that's that's skills attainment, that's a measurable of learning, and so like grades do not ensure that that learning took place, right? So yeah.
Right. And I couldn't agree with you more about that. And I think that's back to, and unfortunately, when you're in a model like that, you get to do both. You get to feed that monster model, right? And then you get to do the student learning outcomes work that is important. And I hate to say it that way, but that's like the double work, plus the perverse incentive of trying to see how we can achieve in that model. Ohio's gotten a little bit, Ohio's model is pretty, I think there's a lot of equity built into it. However, it is a winners and losers model. So it is if my college gets an extra $500,000, there's a college that lost, or a few colleges that lost that money. So there are those issues coupled with the fact that, I'll never understand this. So when people try to throw at me, oh, look at the college scorecard, you have a 20% graduation rate. I'm like, okay, for first-time full-time. So out of 6,000 students, I've got 300 first-time full-time. So you're basing your whole assessment of my institution based on 300 first-time full-time who life happens to, and then suddenly they move to part-time. They graduate in 4 years instead of 2 years or 3 years, which is the measure for the college scorecard. Let's say they graduate 4 years. As far as I'm concerned, they were a success. They finished, they graduated, but to you, they're a failure. So my report card grade went down. It's just, we've got to figure out, and we're all smart enough, and we should all figure out a better model for this and make those recommendations rather than some of this craziness. And I agree what Leslie said earlier about, she kind of looked right into my heart and spoke my truth. How can, and so, yeah, the last thing I'll ask too is, how can we be cultural? I know, it's like I have an identical twin, but anyway, what strategies rather can be implemented to ensure that we're also culturally responsive and inclusive of diverse learner backgrounds? Because I think that's absolutely key too. When we're dealing with a number of different students with different backgrounds, different experiences. I know at Clark State, we're a trauma-informed campus. We've worked very hard to ensure that students feel included, students are valued, students are responded to, but also how we use the trauma-informed lens to design some of the work that we're doing too. Oh, somebody had, Leslie says student success was implemented in California to ration education. And that's not equity.
Can I just make one statement? Our state
Yes.
chancellor, Jack Scott, went around the entire state and said that at every single conference, that was the real purpose. And that's what happened. We lost nearly a million students instead of expanding at a time that was so fundamental to look what's happened in our nation. Truman understood that community colleges were the game changer in terms of creating equity. We really still have that role, and we must fight for it. Thank you for everything you're doing. I don't know, maybe not my role to say that, but I really thank you for everything you're doing.
Well, I appreciate that. And we are, I mean, a lot of folks don't realize that this conversation about student learning outcomes is absolutely about equity. And it's back to our access mission. It's back to community college's mission to serve. Like I always say this when I'm out in public giving a speech or whatever, I say, I accept 100% of any graduating high school class. I mean, I'm not defined by my exclusivity. I'm defined by my inclusivity. So how do we ensure that we're serving, and that extends though, not just to the entry point, but also while they're here at Clark State. But if I could find a way back again to figure out how to define student intent and then show the world how we can, I mean, I need, and I'm going to kind of get weedy for a minute, but our enterprise system is colleague. Like if I could get colleague to put in there, I intended to come here for just one class and I fulfilled my intent. And then I'm like, look, success, I'd have probably not 100%, but I would have like I think one of my provosts calculated it a while back. I'm talking about like 7 years ago. It was something like our success rate was around 65%. It wasn't the 20% graduation rate. We looked at a combination of persistence, course completion, and retention. And when we put this calculation together that he had, I mean, it just told a totally different story about our students and what they're capable of and what they can do. And how diverse they are, because I accept everybody and I want everybody. Not everybody does, and that's, oh my goodness, the future of credentials and laddering. I want to move on to this one document or this one slide so you can see what a mess it all is really fast. Yeah, why are people concerned about the future of all the different credentials? You hear the word credential. And getting assessment of student learning outcomes right so that we can really make changes and difference, because this is our credentialing system. And just take a look at what a mess that looks like. All the different regulation coupled with the different places that are offering, anything from a boot camp to a you get licensed to do this, but is it really a licensure? This is really insane. So this is also impacting the student learning outcome situation, and we need to get control in our own institutions. And then finally, if that visual is confusing to you, it's probably confusing to our students, and our students need us to help us navigate. I mean, because our students don't know where to go. Like they think, I mean, that's why, unfortunately, sometimes they get caught up with bad actors in higher education who purport to be providers of higher education. But if we were to demonstrate student learning outcomes, they would know where to go. They would know we are the best provider and the trusted provider. So that's what we do. We create value for our learners, and that's our purpose.